I'm going to look really, a lot of what I was going to do was covered by Fred on Friday night, so I'm not going to go back on that. I mean, I think there was an excellent talk, a lot of data was produced on the level of financialisation. So I'm just going to try to take some more general arguments about the crisis. Okay, the first thing I think that those of us left should do is develop a much more contemptuous attitude to the people who populate our television screens, who are known as economists. I mean, I have a pet theory that economists have replaced the priesthood in our society as the people who are in touch with the higher powers and tell all of us how we should behave. But it's really important to understand these people do not understand their own system, right? We've been getting, as we know, and with the establishments preening themselves with this, very good remarks from the IMF. But look at these people, right? This is the IMF writing in April. That's only 3 or 4 months ago, right? A few months ago. They're telling us that the global recovery is going to continue. Earlier fears of a double dip, not going to happen, and so on. This is the IMF, okay? In our own country, the ESRI, who consistently get it wrong. So I don't know why they aren't still around, right? Consistently getting wrong. They have predicted a good thing with the ESRI, always go back in their last year's quarterly economic review and you can check how they get it wrong, right? This time they're predicting a growth rate in the Irish economy of 2.7%. Madness, right? The Irish economy is in stagnation. So the fact that these people turn up time after time and give their pro-capitalist message, I think we deserve to give them a little bit more contempt. The reality, as we now know from the OECD report just released a few days ago, is that we are facing effectively a double dip. The recoveries run out of steam. The growth rates of the advanced capitalist economies next year is going to be below 1%. They are in serious trouble. And therefore all the predictions, all the confidence that we're going to move to recovery is completely dissipating fast. And no less a figure than Robert Lucas. Now, you may not be familiar with Lucas, right? But Lucas is one of the, for those people who are in the sort of sect-minded mentality of neoliberalism, he is one of the gurus of the sect, right? One of the theoreticians, won the Nobel Prize for economics, which by the way is a cover for neoliberals, not the other Nobel Prize. But in 1995, he won that prize for economics. He is talking about the possibility of a Great Depression. That's his term, right? In an interesting article he has written recently. And he put, I mean, what he shows, I mean, not that I think Marxists would disagree with this, but that generally speaking, capitalist economies, as Harvey's also pointed out, need to grow at about the rate of 3% a year. And he's plotted the graph in terms of capitalist economies. And what he shows very clearly is the present, what he calls depression, that we're now entering, is of the same scale of the, sorry, not the same scale of the 1930s, but if you like, stands out on this map. Not as significant yet as the 1930s, but nevertheless as a major, if you like, disruption of the system. Now, there's a caveat to be entered on this, which is that we're talking about the advanced capitalist economies. And those who, if you like, still promote capitalism, try to hold out as an optimistic scenario what is happening outside the advanced economies, particularly in China, India, Brazil, and so on. And there are, it has to be said, spectacular rates of growth in these countries. But I think there are a number of reasons to suggest that that's not going to have what they call the decoupling effect. It's not going to rescue the system in a way some of them may have hoped. First reason is that one of the reasons why China, if you like, has powered itself through this period of recession has been a phenomenal high level of capital investment. Very, very high level of capital investment in the Chinese economy. That's geared to, at this point in time, exports. Some of the Chinese Communist Party wish to shift that to the domestic economy, but whether they can do that or not, given some of the class interests connected to exports, connected to foreign multinationals, is very much an open question. Secondly, one of the effects of, if you like, the decline of the advanced economies is the flight of capital sometimes in and out of the emerging economies, causing massive disruption. Brazil at the moment facing, for example, a rise in its currency, which in turn affects exports. And lastly, it's very important to state, and just to build this into the picture, although there had, not although, because in some ways there has been this increase in the emerging economies, one of the major effects of that has been a tremendous level of inflation in these countries. And that level of inflation and price rises, particularly as it affects food, has been one of the major causes of some of the revolts in the Arab world. And Fred was telling me earlier on about the, I think, 100,000 demonstrations in China. This level of inflation is causing social upheaval in many of the developing countries. Therefore, the notion that, if you like, capitalism can come out through the developing countries, I'm not sure that is the case. Now, I think, therefore, what I think is the case is that we're facing a long period, at the very least, of capitalist stagnation, possibly a long depression. That is the scenario in terms of, in my view, global capitalism. And this means that the strategy of the Irish elite really is, I think they face real problems in this, right? Despite their success in imposing cutback after cutback on working people. The Irish elite strategy, I think, can be summed up really in two sentences. One, recapitalise the banks, and then secondly, cut wages, cut public spending in the hope that you can export your way out of the recession. And they have been successful. I mean, in their terms, they have managed to, up to now, recapitalise the banks in a way that has been, and this is not exaggerating, unprecedented in terms of global history. This is in terms of the GNP, if we assume, I'm just using a figure of about 80 billion as the recapitalisation of the banks, taking into account NAM and so on, that is higher than the Argentinian bailout. There have been many, if you look through it, there have been many bailouts across the world. Generally speaking, a bank bailout often takes up about 10% of the GNP of a country. In this little country, it has taken about 62% of the GNP has gone into banks. That has been the first strategy. And of course, the effects of that has been to strangle the Irish economy, to effectively save the banks. And again, we should just note the scale of what's happening here. The American Depression of 1929 to 1933, the economy shrank by around 30%. If we use figures for GNP in this country, the Irish economy has shrunk by about 16%. 16% since the recession began. These are very, very serious disruptions of society. And what they've done, therefore, if you look at the sort of recent global panic in terms of the banking sector over the summer, the panic is focused on, if you like, some of these banks, like the BNP Paribas and so on, not the Irish banks. They've stuffed the Irish banks so full of cash that at this point, the global speculators are looking elsewhere for signs of weakness. But the cost of that has been immense in terms of Irish society. And one of the things, I think the left is very important to argue this, is that often the left gets caught on the usual question, but what about the 18 billion deficit? You mentioned the bank bailouts and so on. One of the effects of this policy of austerity is that Irish capitalists are giving up on Irish society. Irish capitalists are on an investment strike. The figures are there. They're on a major withdrawal of funds from the Irish economy, approximately 100 billion removed last year from the Irish banking system. They are on a massive, if you like, withdrawal of investment from the society over the last period. Now, the government's answer to all of this is that it will all become right when we get the export strategy together. That's a classic IMF argument. Forget about the domestic economy, get your exports together, and all of this will begin to reverse. What we just seen is we're facing into a global period of stagnation, and therefore a strategy based on exporting to the global economy faces major difficulties. Okay, now let me just move then to, before coming to what I think the future for global capitalism is, to saying, well, how do we explain all of this? And what sort of type of concepts can we use to explain it? And I put three down there. You might be interested why I put conspiracy theories down. I'll come to that in a minute. But I think they have a certain vogue in parts of the left at the moment. So although sometimes not be taken seriously, I think it's worth having at least a look at them, right? Conspiracy theory. That this recession was planned by a global elite, that somewhere in the Bilderberg Group, or amongst the Rothschilds, or God knows where, the Freemasons, or the Illuminati, somewhere, there is a command and control centre that is watching and controlling the moves of the system. Now, I travel around the country a lot, promoting socialist politics. I come across a lot of the ideas. I'm very surprised to hear it in the last 1 or 2 years. I think it's to do with the atomization of people. I think it's to do with the if you like, the lack of a vibrant left network where these ideas are discussed and so on. It often expresses people's hatred of the system, but also their experience of powerlessness, and the people therefore see it in terms of conspiracies. And I think that it's also a view, basically, there are elites there who are capable of controlling what's happening. Now, I don't think that is the case, right? And it seems to me that that understanding, or any element of that understanding, or even views, if you like, not conspiracy theorists, but views that there is a transnational capitalist class, or views that there is an empire, if you like, global capitalism is united into one empire, as people like Hart and Negri argued, I think it's wrong. Because of what I think it underestimates is the phenomenal divisions that are now emerging at the heart of the global capitalist system. And to be frank, I'm delighted with it. I mean, one of the points Lenin said in terms of how you get revolution is there's often divisions at the top. It's brilliant to watch these people tearing themselves apart on their inability to get a strategy for the Eurozone. I think there's massive divisions inside Europe, and there's massive divisions inside the American elite. So therefore, I think that notion of conspiracy theory, if you like, it underestimates we know we've got problems, but it underestimates the problems they have in terms of, if you like, dealing with their own system, and it leads to a profound pessimism about the possibility of people to revolt. And I think this year particularly, the Arab revolts really should have scotched those theories. A second approach on the left, I think, has been the question of Keynesianism. Now, I want to be a bit more careful here, because economics departments in Ireland are fanatical neoliberals. They are completely neoliberals. I mean, there's a quote here from a professor, Kevin O'Rourke, in Trinity College. I mean, have you ever seen such garbage, right? That in the middle of the Great Depression, the more wages fell, the less output declined, right? This is the notion, cut wages and output will increase. I mean, have you ever heard such garbage, right? But the fact that somebody puts their professor to their name, for me, I don't put them on a pedestal, right? That's the type of mentality that has been promoted amongst Irish mainstream economists. That's why they get it wrong all the time. Now, given that, when you look at, for example, Robert Reich, you know, who's not exactly a socialist, I mean, when he says, look, the problem in America is that the rich that the mass of people don't get enough to consume, that's a problem. Well, obviously, in that situation, left Keynesianism, or even just Keynesianism, looks pretty okay to what we're getting in terms of the Irish media. But I want to argue, however, that there are limits to it, right? And that's why I think that the left needs to, as I'll try to indicate in a minute, return a bit more to Marx. I think that, first of all, Keynesianism is about trying to restore capitalism. But Keynes made no bones about it. His notion was to manage capitalism in order to bring it back to health. I think that the problem they have is that it starts on the question of demand, right? And not just starts, more or less finishes on the question of demand, and assumes that if the state can stimulate demand, capitalists will follow afterwards and invest. It doesn't follow. It doesn't follow. You can bring the horse to water, but unfortunately you can't make the capitalist horse drink. Okay? So if you leave control of capital in their hands, stimulation of economy faces problems. Thirdly, the actual reserves of the states at the moment, given the size of the global economy, to bring about such a stimulus package is relatively limited. Mark and Wolf give the figure that the size of the stimulus package in America amounts to only 6% over the last period. And lastly, this is important, I haven't really got a chance to emphasise this, the notion that you could have a global Keynesian solution, it underestimates the sheer scale of the inter-imperialist rivalries that are also emerging with the crisis. And I think it's like emerging in very dangerous ways for the future. So I think that therefore, while Keynesianism has been attractive, sometimes to a left that has been a bit demoralised, I think that the left needs to adopt a different approach, right? And therefore, I do want to argue for a return to Marx in terms of trying to understand the crisis and also understand where it's going. Now, just to say on this that Marx is a very rich thinker, and when you read Marx, there is not a set explanation of what is the cause of the crisis. Okay? And therefore, amongst the Marxist tradition, you've had many debates from the 20s to today over what exactly causes the crisis. And I've listed some of the type of arguments there, whether it's underconsumption, mass of people can't buy enough, disproportions between investment and production of capital goods and consumer goods, and the famous one we touched on last Friday, the question of the falling rate of profit. All of these concepts emerge in Marx, but they do so not, and this is where I obviously myself afraid to disagree with the question of the falling rate of profit, but not as dogmatic, single entity explanations, right? Marx gives a very rounded picture to look at consequences and contradictions. Okay, I happen to believe that there is, however, a central a pattern to Marx that's important to the crisis. First, he's the main individual who challenges the original idea of market fundamentalism, that if you like, demand or supply will create its own demand, or vice versa. He challenges that very firmly and shows that capitalism, contrary to all the propaganda, is not driven by consumers. This idea of consumer choice, we decide and capitalists respond to it. That's not what capitalism is. Capitalism is a system designed for the self-expansion of capital. That is what capitalism is. And therefore, any notion that the consumer influences is wrong. Marx focused obviously on the question of workers and the divisions within the the capitalist class about how to get surplus value. Now, the real point I want to make, however, is that the feature of a capitalist crisis, which Marx points to, is vast amounts of surplus capital. This is a standard feature. Vast amounts of surplus capital disconnected and separated from the millions of people who are unemployed. So crisis happens in capitalism not because people don't have enough, but because if you like, the resources of humanity cannot be matched to the willingness of humanity to work and produce. And therefore, as the Communist Party historian said many years ago, the crisis is built into the system. It's a catharsis. It's a way in which that, if you like, readjustments happen periodically. Okay. Right, okay. Okay, so I happen to believe there was a decline in the rate of profit. I just give you have a look at the picture there, right? But in some ways more interesting is actually Marx's countervailing tendencies. So let's assume for the moment, whether you agree or disagree, there has been a fall in the rate of profit in manufacturing industries. What do capitalists do to deal with that problem? And remember, the basis of the problem is the growing amount of capital compared to living labour, which Marx argued is a source of profit. What do capitalists do to deal with that? And if you like, take Marx's 19th century language and translate it back into strategies the capitalist class have, it does very much fix the picture in terms of what's happening at the moment. First of all, this is if you want, what is the future of capitalism? This is the future of capitalism, right? In order to deal with these problems, what do? If you have a smaller number of workers compared to the amount of capital invested, and you're trying to extract more and more from them, how do I do it? Okay? One way of doing it is to increase what Marx calls absolute surplus value, the length of the working week. Make a smaller number of people work longer. What's capitalism doing today? Use the term working life, right? It is absolutely astounding that over the last number of years, it's even more astounding in this country that the standard idea of people retiring at 65 has been torn up, and we're going back to what Winston Churchill brought in 1911, retirement at the age of 68. He brought in, I think, at 70. Okay? Capitalism will increase the working life in order to deal with the problem of its declining rate of profit. The question of relative surplus value. If you read a non-Marxist economist called Francis Green, or you just talk to people about their experience of work, the experience is more stressful. It is more people looking at relaxation exercises and so on, precisely because work has become more stressful. Now remember, in the 1960s, people were writing books about what we do with our leisure time, how will we survive. Now it's a very different world today. And lastly, the question of Marx again uses words like immiseration, and many Marxists often say, oh, that never happened in modern capitalism. We've just had, some of us in the public sector, 15% pay cuts. but not just the pay cuts, the idea of getting rid of pensions, getting rid of, if you like, the pensions at your final stage, defined benefit pensions supposed to be an outrageously leftist demand. All of this stuff is really about immiseration, driving down working conditions. And the figures speak, I'm just rushing through this, the figures speak for themselves in terms of increasing the levels of exploitation. Now, one thing Marx did not deal with, obviously, because the level of state spending in Marx's time is much lower than today. But the other aspect of the capitalist restructuring, where capitalism is going, is dismantling of the welfare state. And again, the pattern is uniform across the world. Top rate, this is from the Financial Times this week. Top rate of income tax average in the advanced economies in 30 years ago was 70%. You paid 70% if you were on the top income, right? Today, down to 40%. A wealth tax. The idea of a wealth tax emerged a bit in this recession. 15 countries had a wealth tax in 1995. It's down to only 3 countries in the world today. Mary's dealt with the whole issue of tax havens and driving down corporate profits and so on. So that is the type of system we're going into at the moment. But the point I want to make is, even though they do all of this, they still face a fundamental problem, which is the catharsis, the crisis to readjust, if you like, the system doesn't have the same effect as the past. And this is because capitalism has grown too big in many parts of the world to allow key companies to go down. It is too integrated into the national state's elite, to allow major corporations to go down. And therefore the crisis drags on and on and on. This is also a feature of capitalism. Okay, the last one I want to deal with very quickly is the question of the left. And really, for me, and I know this is a bit of a debating point, but I'll raise it anyway. I think that what strikes me on the left is, I think the day of the left is coming again. I think that the left is in with a chance. I think the system is in deep trouble. I think the left has major possibilities for gaining over the present period. But nevertheless, there is a pessimism on the left. And that pessimism has to do with who is the agent of change. And ultimately it comes down to the question of the working class, right? The traditional agent of change. There's been a long pattern of left-wing writings essentially questioning whether the working class is up to it. Whether the working class has been bought off, it was the argument in the 60s, is now just a victim of globalisation and can't do anything. This is the type of argument I think has been very dominant on the left at the moment. And obviously those arguments reflect the experience of people. I just want to say first of all that in terms of answering that question, I don't think you can answer that question if you combine the idea of the working class to the manual working class. I don't think if you say the working class today is simply men in overalls who go into factories, I think you've lost the argument, right? I think it's very important to see the working class as anybody who sells their labour, whose labour is controlled by others, and that includes white-collar workers, and in fact many of the professions, nurses, teachers and so on, to quote Harry Braverman, are very much being proletarianised. I mean, the people I teach in UCD, they get a job in the IFSC, they're sitting at computers, with all the hopes and aspirations of the world, and they've been treated very much as a worker. No control of what's happening. Therefore, it's important the left understands the working and not have a manual working class approach to the working class. Nor do I think that the working class has lost it because of globalisation. Recent book by Kevin Dugan, who I think was around here before, made a number of important points that when you hear, for example, that the working class don't have permanent jobs, that's not quite true. We also, of course, there's casualisation going on with the recession, but the actual figures, obviously it's grown since, in terms of the OECD countries, is about 1 in 8 workers are on temporary employment. Only 1% of workers throughout the EU are agency workers. Higher in America, obviously. But nevertheless, the working class have still the power and ability to bring about change. And therefore, and I'll finish on this, the issue for me is not the capacity of workers or the size of the working class which has grown, it is the question of political tradition. And when we look at the big debate in Ireland, what's wrong with the Irish compared to the Greeks, I don't think it's to do with our colonial past. I don't think we've learned to be deferential because of that. I think we've had a good tradition of revolt as well as being colonised. I think it's to do with the tradition of how working class politics, if you like, related to the state and capitalism in the last 10, 20 years. And in Ireland, that has been social partnership, right? It has been social partnership which has aligned the labour movement with the priorities of the Irish state. And that doesn't just operate at the level of the heads of the unions. Systematically, and I know this is a sip-to-shop steward, throughout the union has been brought about a notion we cannot change, we must be realistic, we must first of all cooperate with Irish capitalism, and those traditions, I think, have an immensely damaging effect on our Irish workers. And therefore, to finish, I think the question of where capitalism is going, it depends what the working class do. I happen to believe that this crisis produces a crisis in terms of working class traditions, and there's arguments that are developing inside the working class movement, and a new way of understanding how we relate as workers to society is required. But I think that the crisis provokes that, and I think will bring about a response, and therefore it seems to me that the prospect of, if you like, seeing real resistance in this country as part of a global wave of resistance is still very much a live possibility. Okay, thanks.